The Council, as you know, is committed, both in our programs and our studies, to understanding complex global issues like the one we're going to be discussing tonight. Earlier this week, we released a report that included findings from surveys we've done on American public opinion. We focused a special brief on our immigration data. We found that over the past 20 years, we found a long-term trend of fewer and fewer Americans seeing large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming into the United States as a critical threat. In May, our poll findings showed that 39% of Americans said it was a critical threat. We actually did an October re-poll to see if the summer media had had any influence on the data, 43%. Which is statistically not a significant difference. And then most importantly, though, is the dramatic difference. 2002, 60% of Americans would say that it was a critical threat. 1994, 72%. So we thought that that data was interesting. It's on the back of your bio sheets as well. This issue is really complex. It includes so many different dimensions: root causes, legal framework, US policies in place, the rights of children, border challenges, humanitarian responsibilities, available resources, foreign relations, politics. So we have put together this expert panel to try to address all of these nuances. I want to thank NALAC for their partnership on tonight's event and the MacArthur Foundation for their support of the Council's immigration initiative. I will now turn over to Tara Magner. She's a program officer in the policy research area of U.S. programs at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. She was previously a senior counsel to U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy, and I could honestly think of nobody better to moderate this conversation, as she's been following these issues for many years from all these different angles. Tara will introduce our speakers and lead tonight's discussion, and then we'll have time for questions with the audience before we adjourn at 7:15 tonight. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the program.
Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you to Juliana and the whole team at the Chicago Council. It's been a delight for us at the MacArthur Foundation to work with the Chicago Council and the Immigration Initiative over the last few years on this work. So as Juliana said, I'm going to open with a short bit of background on this incredibly complicated topic, try to synthesize some of the issues and themes, and then I'll introduce our panel, and we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So each year, thousands of children arrive at United States borders alone, without a parent or guardian, and these children are called, under our law, are called unaccompanied immigrant children. Some of them are fleeing threats of harm, some are trafficked or smuggled, some hope to join family members in the United States. And while the recent attention has been focused on children from Central America, as Maria and Oscar and Secretary Chertoff know well, children have come from all over the world, from India, from China, all parts of Latin America and Africa. And so while this phenomenon is not new, the number spiked over the past few years, and in particular with additional children coming from Central America and Mexico. For the decade prior to 2011, the number of children arriving each year was fairly steady, roughly 6,000 to 8,000 children per year. And then the number started to climb precipitously. In 2011, 15,000 children arrived. In 2012, 24,000. In 2013, 38,000. And in the federal fiscal year that just ended, 68,000 children had arrived. A report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was based on interviews with 400 children who had arrived at the US and been apprehended. And that report found that 58% of the children were forcibly displaced because they suffered or faced harms that indicate a need for international protection. Now, that's a UN definition, and it doesn't guarantee that each of those children might win a claim for protection under US law. But it does tell us something about the conditions they fled when they came to the United States. And many of the children that were interviewed by the UN High Commissioner reported threats from organized crime, forcible gang recruitment, domestic violence as the causes of their flight from their countries of origin. And so those numbers climbed, but this summer the numbers shot up very dramatically, and the government was caught unprepared. In addition, the numbers of mothers, single mothers migrating with children spiked as well, and we had about the same number of families arriving as unaccompanied immigrant children. Now, the system of care and custody of these children is incredibly complicated. It involves several federal agencies. I think we all agreed to try to avoid acronyms as much as possible, but to be honest with you, it is an alphabet soup of federal agencies, so bear with us if we fail. But in short, the children are held in federal custody until a family member can be found with whom they can be reunited. The children who aren't reunited with family tend to stay in shelters or facilities, or sometimes are in long-term foster care. The facilities that hold the children are all around the United States. In fact, there are several here in Chicago, holding about 500 children now. Curiously, though, children who've been released to family members don't tend to be in this area. The greater Chicago area had about 350 children released to family members as of the end of August of this year. The parts of the country with very high numbers of released children are California, New York, New Jersey, and the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. But children are everywhere. Families are everywhere, and the children reunited with their families could be in a rural town in Nebraska or in downtown Washington, D.C. And so in the communities that receive the children, there are new challenges to meet. Schools, social services, community programs all struggle to welcome and integrate those children, but it is complicated as there are different languages spoken, and many of the children have suffered trauma either that forced them to leave or that was added on their journey. And then most of the children, almost all of them, are placed into immigration proceedings, into deportation proceedings in the immigration courts. And so now legal aid providers across the country are scrambling and frankly are overwhelmed by trying to meet the volume of children who need to be screened for potential protection and what they call legal relief, and then to ensure that those children can each have a lawyer to defend them in immigration court. For the children who ultimately fail in that claim, they face deportation to their country of origin. Now, some of them can be reintegrated safely, rejoin their family. Often, if there are social services available, education, job training, and other programs, they can be safely returned. But many of the children are still very vulnerable when they are returned to their home countries. And so they may face the gangs that forcibly tried to recruit them in the first place, or the other types of violence that caused them to flee in the first place. So that is the very, very quick overview of the circumstances we'll discuss tonight. And with that, I'll introduce our panel to begin our discussion. You have the full bios, so forgive me, but I'll just introduce individuals. I'll start with Secretary Chertoff to my immediate left. The Honorable Michael Chertoff served as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009, and is currently the Executive Chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group. To his left, Maria Woltjen is the Executive Director of the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights at the University of Chicago Law School. The Young Center serves as child advocate for unaccompanied immigrant children pursuant to federal law, pursuant to a trafficking law that we'll be discussing throughout the night. And then to the far left, Oscar Chacón is the Executive Director of NALAC, the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, and the former president of the Salvadoran American National Network. So, I'll start with you, Secretary Chertoff. I just described that the government faced the arrival of 68,000 children this year, and roughly the same number of families arriving at the border. Can you describe the role of the Department of Homeland Security in responding to migration of this sort, balancing the law enforcement, border security, and humanitarian protections that they face on a day-to-day basis?
So let me just put this in context, because this is a little different than the normal cross-border traffic that the Border Patrol deals with when people are trying to get into the country without authorization or permission. Usually when people are coming here to work or for other purposes, what they're trying to do is sneak past the Border Patrol and get into a city or an area where there's a lot of transportation and then disappear into the country, and then they try to avoid being caught. This particular population is almost the opposite. They actually, once they set foot in the country, actually look to be found by the Border Patrol, because they're not trying to elude capture, they're trying to get into a legal process that will allow them to be here, and if they're seeking to get asylum, that will allow them to have their asylum application processed. So it's not a conventional law enforcement responsibility for the Department of Homeland Security with this population, since you're not chasing people. People are actually going, here I am. What you're trying to do is figure out, how do you house them, how do you process them, how do you make sure that if in fact they are in proceedings, they appear for the proceedings, and how do you deal with some of the complications that are presented with a vulnerable population. The other thing to bear in mind is this, though. The real humanitarian threat posed to this population doesn't occur when they arrive in the U.S. It's when they get here, when they're on the way of getting here. If you are a child and you are put in the hands of a smuggling organization, and they're going to move you through Central America and through Mexico, you're going to be at risk as a child. And in fact, many of these children, and children go up to 17 or 18, are victimized by the smuggling organizations, raped, brutalized, held as victims for ransom. So as one considers whether you are attracting people to try to make this crossing, to present themselves for asylum when they arrive in the U.S., you have to understand that you're inducing them to embark upon a very, very perilous journey, one that's much more dangerous for children than it is for adults. So from the standpoint of the Department of Homeland Security, there are two separate issues. How do you deal with those who presented themselves and make sure you can maintain them in a humane but secure setting so they can be processed? But also, how do you discourage people from making the trip in the first place? Because chances are some of those who start the trip will not finish it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a terrific lead-in, Oscar, the question to you, which is looking past the border. Can you discuss the circumstances that are causing children to embark on this journey at this point, knowing something about the dangers they face?
I'd be happy to. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand, and you kind of address it at the beginning in the introductory comments, the question that most Americans ask is, what is the reason? As if there was one, reason. But the reality is, this is a situation where many factors have converged at the same time. And in many ways, they are the perfect storm, so to speak, just because while, we would love to have literally 3-second answers, to a question like this, the reality is that there are multiple factors. Clearly, the situation of violence, if we look at statistics, the increase in the number of homicides that are happening, whether it is in Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala, is notably higher over the last year or so. And so clearly the violence factor plays heavily into the decision to undertake this journey. The situation having to do with insecurity, namely the incapacity of governments, forces there to ensure safety in neighborhoods also counts. And I can tell you that there are plenty of examples of authorities there recognizing privately, that they find themselves powerless in terms of really stopping organized crime or gangs that have become so prevalent there. And 3, there is also a structural, more long-term problem, and that is that these countries, no matter from what angle you look at it, have actually failed to provide a good percentage of opportunity for people to have a chance of a decent life there. So what's important to keep in mind, and I can tell you this with great deal of certainty, people do know what are the risks that they are going to face when they migrate. The question we should be asking ourselves, is, what is so bad back there that in spite of the risks that are involved that the Secretary just mentioned, and people know them, they are essentially choosing the option of leaving. So it's kind of choosing the lesser of evils in a circumstance that is just really bad altogether. And so I think it is important to, later on in the conversation, perhaps address what, if anything, can be done, in the short term that can truly deal with this situation in a way that is responsible, that is humane, and that is long-lasting.
Excellent. And Maria, the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act, a very long name for a law, was enacted in 2008 with very strong bipartisan support, was signed into law by President George W. Bush, and that law responded to exactly some of the circumstances Oscar just described, and circumstances around the world of trafficking victims, adults and children. But it did contain some special protections for unaccompanied immigrant children, and those protections have come under attack by some in Washington who believe they may be encouraging, that those provisions of law may encourage migrants to come. So Maria, can you help us understand a little bit more about the legal framework? What does the anti-trafficking law say about legal protection for unaccompanied immigrant children? Does it regulate the way that deportation cases are handled? And do you think it's driving migration now?
Sure. Well, I think I'm going to start with your last question first. I don't believe that the law is driving the migration. The law was passed in 2008, and the number of children and families that started coming, the increase started happening in 2011 and doubling after that. So the law had been in effect for many years, and yet we didn't see many children coming. What does the law provide? I mean, the protections are very important. They're also fairly subtle. So a child who may be eligible for asylum, and I just want to be clear, asylum is very difficult to get. It's very difficult to establish, especially for a child. But a child who may be eligible for asylum, instead of going in front of a judge and an adversarial hearing, can have an interview first. The law doesn't provide for lawyers for children, but encourages or provides that one of the federal departments will find pro bono lawyers to represent the children. So all children are not provided attorneys. They have a right to an attorney, but not at government expense. So that's another piece. The law provides for the appointment of child advocates, and child advocates' role is to advocate for the best interests of the child, except that we don't have a best interest standard in our law. And then one piece that I think is very important is that it provides for the safe repatriation of unaccompanied children who may not be eligible to remain in the United States. And it requires that the governments look at Department of State reports to figure out whether it's safe for these children to go back. And I think that's an extremely important part of the anti-trafficking law. I also think it has not really been implemented. There's actually very little investigation that happens before a child is returned to their home country. But having said that, it's really an important law. It provides additional protections for children from the non-contiguous countries that Tara mentioned, from Central America, India, China, Somalia, Romania, and it provided for some additional screening of children from Mexico, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think the law is very important, it's critical, and I think those of us who work with unaccompanied children really want to preserve that law and don't want to see it amended for fear that we'll lose a lot of the protections that took so many years to get.
Great. So I think as we were chatting before the panel started, and most of you probably know, the number of arrivals has dropped since August, September. And so instead of hundreds of children arriving a day, hasn't ended, but it is at a much lower pace. And so the big question everyone's asking now is this simply a lull? Will the numbers increase again? Is the migration cyclical? Maria said the Border Patrol seems to have a very strong record of predicting how these flows will come. So I think this is a question for all of you, but maybe starting with you, Secretary Chertoff, with your experience in the very high oversight role of the Border Patrol, do you think that we'll see another wave of arrivals coming? And if so, how can the government better prepare for that?
You know, I think there is a seasonal element to this, but I have to tell you that the number that came over this past summer was staggeringly greater than the number that we used to have when I was in office, for example. I mean, by orders of magnitude. It was clearly a paradigm shift. It's a little hard to know why. I think there's a number of factors. I think, as was said earlier, there are increased problems in many of the countries in the region, although, frankly, there were problems back when I was in office as well. I think one of the factors was a certain amount of confusion fostered by smuggling organizations who, remember, they have an economic interest, the criminal groups, in having people sign up to send their kids or adults on this perilous journey. So they're essentially advertising or marketing a promise at the other end, which in many cases is a false promise. In this case, I think what happened is some confusion about what was going to happen in the U.S. with respect to people who had entered illegally became a marketing tool for smuggling organizations who said, oh, now's the time. If you can make it up to the United States, there's going to be an amnesty, everyone's going to be allowed to stay, and it's going to be like a picnic. But as was said earlier, in fact, the way the law is now, it is very difficult to get asylum. You don't get asylum under U.S. law, and I used to do these cases when I was a Court of Appeals judge, just because there are bad conditions in your home country. You've got to show that you've been persecuted because of some factor like your race, your religion, your social organization, your political views, and there are a couple of other very specific categories. Economic difficulty is not a basis for asylum. Disorder and violence in general is not a basis for asylum. So in many cases, there may be a deep misunderstanding fostered by the smuggling organizations about what's going to happen when you get to the United States. And then the third factor is, and I learned this when I was dealing with this issue on a daily basis at Homeland Security, much of what actually influences people's decision to come is a perception of whether, in practical terms, they're going to wind up getting to stay in the U.S. for an extended period of time. If the process of removing people who are not legally eligible to be in the country is a very long, drawn-out process, or if there is, to be blunt, a real likelihood that people who are put into proceedings will wind up disappearing and never showing up for the result, then that encourages people to try to make that trip. If you send people back relatively promptly when they're not legally entitled to asylum, and if they're not able to simply disappear while the process is ongoing, that tends to discourage people from making that trip. And we saw that when I was in office, because when I came in 2005, for a variety of reasons, a very large percentage of people who were apprehended coming in illegally were released on bail and never showed up for their legal proceedings, like 70 or 80%. As soon as we changed the process to make it quicker and to return people more readily, we saw that number begin to drop off, because the people who were contemplating the trip were very acutely sensitive to what was going to happen when they arrived in the United States. So I think part of what you have seen in the last few months is the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Johnson, has made an effort, even within the framework of the law, to speed the process up. And as people in the sending countries have begun to see unaccompanied minors or families getting returned, that has dampened to some extent the enthusiasm for making that trip. So there's a seasonal element, there's an enforcement element, and I think, because of these factors working together, we may see an uptick again, but we may not see quite the uptick that we had in the summer.
All right, I have a lot of follow-ups to that, but I want to start, Oscar, with you, because everyone who works on immigration issues right now is anticipating that President Obama may announce, through an executive order, a legalization program for some of the undocumented immigrants that are in the United States now. Nobody knows exactly what the scope of that will be, exactly what the eligibility factors might be, but given some seasonal trends and the possibility of something like that being announced in December or January, what are your predictions about whether we'll see another influx of migration?
Well, first of all, let me share with you that I just came back from visiting for the first time McAllen. I had never been to McAllen, Texas. I've been to many other border towns, but never to McAllen. And one of the things that really caught my attention is to hear almost everyone working on the question of basically welcoming kids that have been in detention, whispering the rumor that apparently everybody's talking about, that as soon as probably mid-December, we are bound to see indeed an increase in the number of people coming in, including unaccompanied children. True or false? I mean, that is what everybody is repeating. Now, there is something I didn't mention before that I want to bring into the conversation, and it is the fact that we are also talking about a situation that is hard to understand given how politicized migration has become in the country. And it is the fact that a lot of these kids that we are talking about, virtually all of them, actually have a mom or a dad in the US. And many of these kids were left behind when they were literally infants. You know, the grandmother that was responsible to care for them in the home country no longer can. And so there is a practical reality of badly needed family reunification. But it cannot happen because very often the parents that are here don't have immigration status or have something precarious, you know, like temporary protected status. So clearly, let's not forget that the way all this is playing out has a very difficult, troublesome context, which is the fact that our immigration law altogether, including humanitarian protections, are badly in need of repair. And that is something everybody agrees. You know, the question is, how can we possibly make that happen? We've been trying for years without success so far. And I think that it is precisely that lack of capacity to take action in the legislative arena to fix all these problems that have led, you know, to the conversation that really began much earlier than now, to the effect that the president should be able to use powers that are vested in the office of the president to be able to provide some degree of relief for people who are here. But whatever relief the president may be able to provide will not go nearly as far as he needs, you know, to go. Just because, again, the president cannot possibly fix on his own. You know, the fact that these kids need family reunification, that's not something that they will be able to provide. And so I really believe that we are in face of a probably more complex situation as, you know, the next few months come about, especially if indeed there is an announcement of a meaningful latitude by the president. I cannot see how that is not going to be used by the very criminal organizations that are in the business of smuggling people, trafficking people. And again, that's why I was saying earlier, imagining the solutions to these challenges require to be far more creative, far more courageous than we've been able to be so far, you know, on such a tragic issue of migration. I end this portion just by saying that I really feel that our immigration law and the capacity to reform it is frankly way behind, you know, to the realities that bind so closely together the lives of people in Central American countries, Mexico, and the US. Let me just remind you of one very concrete fact that we don't even think about. Every single day, 10,000 people reach the age of 65 in our country. And that's going to be a trend that will remain in place until the end of the year 2030. That presents us with a humongous problem because, in fact, you know, I was watching the news just the last couple of days. They just revised the rate of growth of our economy, you know, from 3.1 to 3.5 in the past quarter. There are many signs that finally the economy is recovering. I am very worried because what that means potentially is more job generation in areas of the economy that it is a proven fact that we don't have the capacity to fulfill just with the domestic labor force. And I believe that that calls very urgently for action.
And that could be another draw, too,
Absolutely.
for undocumented migration. All right, I'm going to follow up on another of the Secretary's points with you, Maria, which is the length it takes for immigrants of all sorts, but in particular newly arriving children and others, to have an immigration court hearing. And I think it's an area where everyone from law enforcement to immigrant advocates and attorneys can agree that system takes far too long. But what is the right balance? What is the right amount of time that should be provided to, let's say a child is fortunate enough to have an attorney and has a potential claim. What do you think would be the right amount of time to prepare a case, but not so long that people are languishing either in detention shelters or just waiting endlessly for a hearing, and then, with the potential for disappearing into the wind and not showing up at that hearing when it finally occurs?
Sure. I mean, I think the root of the problem, though, is that the immigration courts are severely under-resourced. We need a lot more immigration judges. We need more support for immigration judges. There are, here in Chicago, I believe, 12 to 13 immigration judges, and they have 2 clerks serving all of them. So it's an incredible workload, and so I think the problem is not because the child or the adult is taking time to prepare the case. The problem really is that the immigration court has to schedule these cases out far enough so that it can handle the current cases. Now, what's happened recently, though, is that the government has prioritized certain cases involving recent arrivals that includes adults, but also unaccompanied children. So what that means, though, is that the child gets reunified with family or a sponsor, and within 21 days they have to appear in immigration court. It's ideal if the children have an immigration attorney, but many of these children do not have an immigration attorney. So they have to make their way to this building, they have to walk into that building, they have to find the courtroom, they have to walk into that courtroom. I've been an attorney for 25 years, I still get nervous when I walk into a courtroom. So you can imagine a child. And in many courts around the country, there's no system in place where there's someone who walks around to see, is Juan Perez here? If he is, come and talk to me and I'll go into court with you. These kids have to figure it out on their own. So it's very, very difficult for them to go through the system. I agree that the time period should be shorter. I think that it's really difficult if you come in as a child and your case isn't heard for 3 to 4 years. Now you're an adult, you may have married, you may have had children, you're integrated in the community, and now we're going to make a decision about whether you can stay or go, and this can result in families being torn apart, children left here, citizen children left behind while undocumented people are deported. So I agree that it's a real problem. But to go back to your question, Tara, about timing, I think one of the issues is these are children. They have to be treated differently. They need the time, first of all, to recover from what's happened to them. They need the time to be able to tell their stories to someone. Many of these kids have experienced trauma, and they're not going to sit down with a Border Patrol officer who's in a uniform and tell them their story immediately. And even Border Patrol officers will say, as Secretary Chertoff said, I'm here for enforcement, I'm here to catch people. My job isn't really to interview children. Yes, I've received some training, but that's not really what I want or should be doing. And so the kids may not disclose what they've been through. They really need the time to do that. And they need an attorney to navigate our immigration system, which it's complex for a lawyer and very difficult for an adult, and I would argue nigh impossible for a child to get through the system without an immigration attorney who knows what they're doing.
All right, well, since it is the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, we want to pull back a little bit and look at these issues in a wider context. And so if we think about the number of child migrants and even families that arrived at the border in the past year, it's about 150,000 people. It's actually not a very large number, especially by comparison to some of the other global situations involving refugees around the world. So for example, Lebanon has added 25% to its population with refugees coming from Syria. 1 million Syrians are in Lebanon right now. And so I'm curious with the panel to think through this issue. Why would the U.S. respond with such a feeling of panic to what is comparatively a very small number? And then how does that influence the U.S. government's ability to ask other countries to take in refugees and keep their borders open if we don't keep our own borders open? Oscar, would you like to start?
Yeah, of course. I think it would put us in a precarious situation. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we are often, especially in global events, as one who has attended plenty of them, I mean, I can tell you that we love to pose, I mean, as the model child, you know, in relationship to how to be generous, how to be understanding. So if we were to indeed just close, you know, our borders, close our hearts, I mean, to these particular dilemmas, we would really look bad, you know, because it would be a classical case of do as I tell you, but not as I do. And I think that that's something important to keep in mind. I mean, I personally feel that it is indeed something that the media often really takes out of proportion. I mean, 69,000 people is probably fewer people than we put in a stadium on a night, I mean, of a good game, just like last night. I think it is important to really acknowledge the fact that the way we debate, you know, about these issues, both in Congress, but also in the public arena, through our media, is not responsible, because we often make it sound as if it is a problem far, far bigger than it really is. And I think we need to also, we need to push basically our policy makers, our elected officials, to be more responsible in the way we talk about this, and to really think about the implications these have about the image of the United States of America as a true beacon of hope.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
So I guess I think we have to be careful to separate a couple things out. First of all, most of the controversy about illegal immigration, you know, putting aside what happened this last summer with the child migrants, is directed at economic migrants, people who are coming to the U.S. to work. That's not quite the same thing as refugees and the border of Syria. And I think, you know, the concern people have about that is not necessarily that they don't want to bring people in to work either temporarily or permanently, and I agree. I think that the economy actually needs to have growth, particularly as the population ages. But I think a lot of Americans say, we'd like to actually have a hand in that decision and decide who comes, and have us be the ones who say, yes, you can come in, not have other people unilaterally say, I'm going to come to the U.S. to work, and, you know, catch me if you can. I think the issue of refugees, people fleeing violence, is a subset of the immigration issue, which has gotten essentially conflated with it. And here, I think the issue is a little different. If you look at the refugees fleeing in Syria or Iraq, I mean, frankly, the countries that are receiving them are putting them in camps. There's no sense they're going to be integrated into the country. They're going to be living in tents, getting relief from the Red Cross for the foreseeable future. That's not how we treat people who are coming in as refugees. We actually have taken refugees. When people get asylum, they're resettled, they're integrated into the community. One of the constructive proposals on the issue of child migration is to actually have asylum proceedings in the sending country, so that people can file a claim for asylum. If they, in fact, have a basis, they can then come to the United States, but they don't make that journey from the home country to the United States in that dangerous fashion. You know, the challenge here is to recognize this. However sympathetic you are to the plight of people in countries where there's disorder, and putting to one side, again, the fact that the legal standard for refugee status is not just my home country is a bad place to live. It's much narrower than that. It is, even bearing those things in mind, it is not a humanitarian gesture to encourage children to be sent on a 1,000+ mile journey in the hands of criminals. It's one thing to say we want to entertain asylum applications where you live, and if you qualify will give you refugee status. It's another thing to say if you can survive the 1,000-mile crossing and come here illegally, then you'll have an opportunity to have your asylum adjudicated. So I agree with the point earlier. You need to look at this problem holistically. I spent 4 years with an enormous amount of time trying to do immigration reform. And there actually is a solution that allows you to reconcile all these issues. But we just have not been able to get the political consensus to get that done.
If I may add, Tara, just to broaden the conversation, see, part of the problem, and I wasn't being rhetorical when I said earlier that our humanitarian laws are out of sync. You know, when you really look at what is happening on a daily basis in San Pedro Sula, Tegucigalpa, San Salvador, Guatemala City, these are places that are within the 5 top countries in terms of numbers of homicides, believe it or not. You know, you can just go Google it if you want to. Nowadays, it's impossible to lie or make up, facts. But what's important is our laws, and I'm not only holding accountable the U.S., I'm holding accountable the international community. We have not yet been able to update our laws in ways that takes into account that the kind of turmoil that is caused by gangs, by narco-trafficking organizations at neighborhood levels in these communities is no short from the kind of disruption that you find in a war setting. And so yet, for war setting circumstances, we have rules, but for the kind of turmoil that goes on in these countries, we don't. And so that's partly what I mean when I say that we really need to do harder thinking and find the courage to be able to accommodate these realities. Now, I'm not suggesting, that we say everybody who wants to come should come. I believe there is another portion of this conversation that has to do with what can we possibly do to truly help these countries become a different place. Places that can actually offer their citizens the wish to stay there. And that's a different challenge that I hope we can talk a little bit about.
I think that's a really important point because it's part of a larger discussion. We live in the era of failed states, states that do not control what goes on within their own sovereign jurisdiction or where there's disorder. And whether it's, transnational criminal groups that make life miserable and essentially chase people in search of asylum, or groups like ISIS who, behead people and chase, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people away because they're afraid they're going to get killed because of ideological reasons. In some sense, the problems in those countries become global problems. And that raises the issue whether at some point we do need to get more engaged in what happens in these countries. And that gets you into discussion about responsibility to protect and what is the right of a sovereign country when it's essentially so out of control that it's exporting its problems to other parts of the world. So I think this is all part of a really large set of issues.
And I'm sorry, why don't you go ahead, Maria?
I just wanted to add, I think the conversation, and I agree with a lot of the points that have been made, but I think they're primarily based on a system that was developed for adults. And we're talking about children here. We're not talking about adults. And I think that factors in both to the violence that's happening in these communities, that the children are targets of the violence, that, and this is to Oscar's point, that 55% of the children have a parent in the United States. And that parent, if they're afraid their child is in danger, they want their child with them. It's human nature. You want to protect your children, and you're afraid that it's worse to leave them there than to bring the child here. I agree that I think the reasons are very tangled. I think that the smugglers are out there giving misinformation, and that is causing some of what's happening. But I think what we have to focus on is the fact that we're talking about child migrants, not adult migrants. It's a system that was intended for adults. Secretary Chertoff talked about what's required to establish for asylum. And I think for children, though, we have to look at it in terms of the dangers they face as children, and which is in a different way than you would look at a case involving an adult.
All right, I think we're ready to open up to the audience for questions. And so Juliana will retake the helm. And I think that there are Chicago Council colleagues with microphones, and so if someone has a question.
Yes, please. And wait for the microphone to come to you. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And I know we have one right over here in the second row. And if you could state your name, introduce yourself, that'd be great. Thanks.
First of all, thank you for your great conversation and for bringing very important points to the discussion. My name is Loida Rosario, and I just want to understand numbers a little bit better. For example, what percentage of children who are in this most recent migration have parents in the U.S.? Did you say 55%?
55% of the children are reunified with one or two parents in the U.S., yes.
So of 68,000 kids, we're talking about maybe another 25 who are left without that kind of potential solution, which is to be with the parent.
Well, they may not have parents, but some of the kids have other relatives who they can be reunified with.
Okay, and of the ones who have migrated this year, how many so far has been brought back to the place of origin, and what has been the result?
I think the children are still going through the system. So I think that the original, what was happening this last summer really impacted the system of care and custody, taking care of the children, providing them with shelter. Now what is going to be significantly impact is the immigration adjudicatory system. So judges handling many, many more cases involving children, NGOs needing to find attorneys to be in court to staff those cases. This is where I think everything has shifted right now.
But if I may add, the numbers are a bit deceiving because, yes, there has been a decrease in the number of adult and children arriving at our border. Now, that does not mean that the number of kids leaving Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala has reduced. What it means is that Mexico has become far tougher in terms of controlling flows. And I can tell you, having just been myself, in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, back at the beginning of the year, the number of people being deported from Mexico were frankly a handful. The number of people being deported now, it's far, far greater. Now, what has actually happened is that, we probably asked Mexico for a favor, and Mexico is doing the favor. In terms of really getting tough, I even hear now that Guatemala is becoming a lot harder to transit than it ever was. So, again, the numbers of kids leaving, the number of adults leaving may not necessarily be lesser now than it was 3 months ago. It's just that those reaching our border are fewer.
And I would just like to add to that, it really is a regional issue, and both children and families are not only coming to the U.S., but they're also going in much larger numbers to surrounding countries to the south, Costa Rica, Panama. So those countries are seeing many more people coming and applying for asylum than they've seen in years past.
Those statistics are about 400% increase in asylum applications in the other countries of Central America.
One other data we didn't mention, Tara, is that the actual number would be closer to 85,000 in the last fiscal year, the one that ended September 30th, if we were counting the Mexican kids.
Right.
But we're not counting the Mexican kids because Mexican kids are regarded, are treated differently simply because they belong to a country with continuous borders with the U.S., which TVPRA, the Traffic Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, establishes that they would be treated differently. And there is now evidence, that a lot of these kids are not necessarily just coming for the trip, to the U.S., but that many of them also have legitimate complaints from a humanitarian nature. I'm sure you've been following the news. What's been happening in Guerrero in the past several weeks, and the findings of more and more common graves. None of the 43 kids, that were lost. So very concerning about what's also happening in Mexico.
Next question right here, second person in our row.
It has been reported that the, excuse me, the Obama administration might be thinking of transferring funds to governments in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador for the express purpose of combating some of the violence there and hopefully keeping some of the children there in a safer environment. Is there any update to this particular plan?
Well, President Obama asked for money, asked for supplemental funding, $3.9 billion. And that got caught up in, congressional disagreements. Very difficult these days for the House and Senate to agree on very much, and they certainly did not agree to that. I think some of us are, this may be part of the executive action that President Obama takes when, if and when he does that. I think it is really important. I think most people agree that this is a region, we're part of the region, and we need to support these countries in some way. We're neighbors. And so that means, providing money to these countries to try to improve the situations in these areas of violence. And I'm not saying that's easy. I mean, it's not easy anywhere, so it's not going to be easy there. But trying to improve the situation, trying to provide some additional resources for young people in those countries and for families so that they won't be so desperate to leave. I think that's one of the, it's one piece of what needs to be a lot of different things to be done to solve this problem.
This may change, but I can tell you that so far, the only new money that I know of is money that is actually being used to pay for public relation campaigns. Essentially, to tell people in these three countries, do not leave because it's too dangerous and you may even lose your life, as if people didn't know, that is the case. Now, going forward, it may be different, and we can certainly talk more about that as well.
Right. My understanding is that in August or September, the Vice President announced the expenditure of some funding from current sources, but to have new money appropriated, as Maria said, will require congressional action. Yeah. And so there may be something in a new continuing authorization for spending or a new appropriations bill in the future. But the money that was reallocated earlier this year is on a smaller scale.
Great. Let's get a question right here on the end, please.
Follow-up question to the one that was just asked. The point made about assisting countries, excuse me, to improve their law and order is arguably a controversial one that is currently being implemented and has been failed and corrupt and been focused towards just stopping the flow of drugs and other crime. So how will the shift in paradigm and rhetoric really make a difference in the results of improving law and order for children? And how is throwing money at the problem really making a difference? Thank you.
Anyone like to take that?
Yeah, I don't think you can just throw money at the problem, but I do think that one thing we need to explain to the American people that when you assist another country in getting control of what's going on inside its own borders, you're actually contributing to the national security of the United States because you are, first of all, striking at some of these gangs where they're based, and second, you are diminishing the push that is sending some of these people into the United States and creating an enforcement problem on our border. We worked with Mexico over a number of years. Not entirely successfully, but there's been some success in getting the Mexicans to upgrade their own internal security with some notable exceptions. And that's wound up actually being beneficial to the U.S. as well. But I agree, you can't just send money. It's got to be tied to conditions, operational presence, training, and actually having people in place to assist the local governments pursuing these groups. And that involves not just police money, but also changing the judicial system so it operates efficiently, and the prison system, so that when people go into prison, they don't continue to conduct their criminal activities from inside their jail cell.
I can add to that we have had a passion for the past 3 decades almost to think that we can fix everything by punishing. And I can tell you that in Central America, there has been plenty of so-called law and order approaches. Iron fist, mano dura, has been indeed a very popular, policy in several of the Central American countries. I would argue that just like in the case of immigration policy, humanitarian protection, we are also in desperate need to rethink, how do we see international policy? How do we see the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and many of these countries, the regional role of the U.S. In what it is, for all practical purposes, our periphery? And we do have vital interest there, but I can assure you that just putting more money into a law enforcement or law and order approach is not going to prove to be enough. I mean, there is much more that needs to be done. And let's remember, some of the problems that these countries are now enduring have a lot to do with us. Look, if we weren't so hungry for consuming cocaine, there wouldn't be so many problems in some of these countries. We have to acknowledge the fact that we have a major responsibility just by virtue of the fact that we are, still consuming illicit narcotics at a pace that is just irresponsible. And so we have to fix that problem here. That's not even there, but it does have consequences there.
So are you advocating
Couldn't hear.
All right. Next question.
That's one of the many ideas. I think it may be worthwhile to look into it. It's not the only one.
We're going to have a question over here in the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Rachel Cole. I have a question regarding, there was a recent policy introduced into Congress that's now in committee, VIVA, so the Vulnerable Immigrant Voice Act. I wonder if any of you see this as a viable sort of policy. I know it has just maybe a 3% passage rate at this point, but in order to provide UACs with representation, because it is a huge problem in that they have to navigate the system by themselves, especially with a speeded process when they're unable to find pro bono work. So I just wonder what sort of take you have on that sort of policy, if you see that as a feasible alternative, or if there's some other answer for UACs that are already in country.
I mean, I think it's just really, really important to provide attorneys for children. I don't know what the percentage likelihood of this law passing is. I probably wouldn't put it much higher than you did. There are efforts happening right now, and I think they're terrific. There's one program that's going to provide brand new attorneys around the country. Another, Health and Human Services is just issued funds to provide some representation for children around the country. It's a drop in the bucket though. And I think every child needs an attorney. I think every child, whether they've been screened as eligible or not, needs an attorney to represent them in the immigration process. I think it's important because I also think that neither judges nor asylum officers nor immigration officials want to make a decision about a child if that child doesn't have someone representing them or making the case for them, because they don't have all of the information. And so in my experience, I think all of the actors, even inside of the judicial system and the enforcement system, they would like to see attorneys. They would like to make sure that there's someone there who can speak to the child's safety.
I think it's important to note the Senate bill that passed last summer, or a year ago in the summer, included several provisions that would provide counsel for unaccompanied immigrant children, provisions to expand the number of judges in the immigration courts and get to some of that backlog. So at this point, that bipartisan Senate bill may also have a 3% or less chance of becoming law in this Congress, but there is, I think, some legislative history that advocates can build upon going forward.
Okay, right up here, actually, the second one.
I'm curious, are there any statistics about the immigration status of the individuals that these children are being reunited with? And does their status help or hinder these kids in terms of successfully navigating the court system?
I don't know the statistics on how many children are reunified with parents or relatives or sponsors who have status, I'm afraid. I mean, I think that what matters the most is whether there's an attorney there, and I'm not sure that it always makes a difference whether the family is documented or not. It depends, you know, certainly on the economic state of the family and whether they can afford to hire an attorney. But, you know, if they can't, it doesn't matter. I mean, then, you know, they need to find an attorney, and if they can't afford one, then you've got a child going to court without one. So I think it's just really critical that they have a lawyer.
Okay, we're going to go up here now, and then I'm going to try to get somebody back there next time. So
You mentioned a little earlier some of these cases taking 4 years. I hate to think of children growing up, waiting. If you had the resources, what is a realistic, reasonable amount of time that a child could go through this process? I mean, what's the best we could give you if you had the resources?
I mean, I think if the child has the time to recover from whatever trauma the child has experienced, the time to be able to talk to an adult and tell that adult their full story, to have an attorney. I mean, you'd have to ask an immigration attorney how long it takes to prepare a case. And
could this be done in a year or two?
I think it could be done in a year if you had immigration judges who could, you know, take the case and move it through. Well, I don't know. It really very much depends on the case. But what I would argue is that we shouldn't be pushing these cases through really quickly. So there have been efforts, and some judges are giving very brief continuances to kids, and in fact too brief for them to go out and find an attorney. So that makes it very, very difficult. So I don't think we should be speeding these cases up at warp speed. I think there is a reasonable amount of time. I mean, it's time, you know, for the child to be able to talk about what they went through, and time to have an attorney, and for that attorney to prepare the case.
I do think you could probably do it more quickly. I'll tell you why, because, and I want to come back to the point I made earlier. The grounds for which you can successfully get asylum are relatively narrow. And at bottom, what you're doing is you're explaining what happened to you that puts you in one of these very specific categories. It's not my life is bad, the country I'm coming from is bad. That's not going to satisfy the legal standard. So I think, and here you can argue that actually attorneys are helpful. Refining the claims down to what might really be a colorable claim, I think is not that difficult a task. And then the other thing is how many appeals you get. Now, when I was sitting on the Court of Appeals, we saw cases that went on for years because they went up and down and up and down. And I do think at some point you've got to basically put a box around this and say, you know, you have a certain amount of time to present your claim. You get one appeal. But if you go beyond that, you do start getting cases where years go by, and that has two negative consequences. First, it encourages people to believe that, in effect, they're getting an amnesty because while the process is going on, they're here in the United States. And second, at the end of that process, if it turns out that the case has no merit, and I will tell you, the vast majority of asylum claims get rejected on the law. Then the person says, well, wait a second, I've been living here for 4 or 5 years, it's not fair to send me back anymore. It's a little bit like what you see in death penalty cases, where years are spent litigating the case, and then at the end someone says, yeah, but it's been 10 years since the crime was committed, it's not fair to, you know, now carry out the punishment. So I do think that without sacrificing the essential ability of someone to make a legitimate claim, there is a way to get this done within a matter of months and not a matter of years.
It seems it's particularly cruel in the situation of the child, because then this is all they know, this country. And if it's going to take you 4 or 5 years to give them a fair shot, and then they're, you know, I can see you don't want to rush it, but at the same time, you can't do this within whatever you decide is a reasonable amount of time. It seems more cruel to drag it out for 4 or 5 years than that's.
And one thing that can be a very valid use of time, it doesn't have to take an exceptionally long time, but a child with a skillful attorney can identify whether there is a claim, and if there is a claim, how to prove it. And so an attorney with resources can collect the evidence that might make that case strong enough that it does get granted earlier and doesn't need to go through an appeals process. So there is some value to that extra time. Doesn't have to be forever, but to give an adequate level of preparation to a case.
I'm going to turn over to Mary McCarthy with NAJC, who I know has also been working very closely on these issues.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just want to follow up on that last point because I do think the area of asylum and refugee law is really in flux, as we've seen in the different courts. At the National Immigrant Justice Center, we represent a lot of these children and asylum seekers and refugees, not only in-house, but also with, about 1,500 pro bono attorneys. And in the Seventh Circuit, we've seen a real development in the area of refugee law and asylum law, and recently in the Board of Immigration Appeals, a recognition of domestic violence of a Guatemalan woman being recognized as a refugee. And that's an area that's really been developing. So I think it's a lot more complex right now, the area of refugee law, and the jurisprudence is developing. So the need for an attorney is more critical than ever. I agree, we don't want these cases going on for 4 or 5 years, nor do the children, nor do their parents. So, but I do think there is a reasonable time, and as Tara mentioned, a skilled, experienced immigration attorney can really help develop that and ensure due process. I also wanted to speak to the question about the parents. When we've represented these children, we've noticed a lot of the parents and the family members also have some type of opportunity to secure legal protections. And the parents who've been here for many years have different forms of legal relief under the immigration laws, but never came forward before. And we saw that with DACA, with Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So I think there's a lot of people in our communities right now who are not citizens, but would have an opportunity or a path to citizenship if they secured legal representation. So I think what's really important now more than ever, and I hope that this influx has brought awareness in our communities and the public, that we ensure due process protections for individuals who are, especially those who are fleeing persecution and seeking protection and safety. Yes, the courts work, and if that individual doesn't belong here, that decision should be made in less than 4 or 5 years, for sure. If that person needs protection, let's get him protection and integrate it into our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Meg. We have a question up here in the front.
I think I'm just going to build off of Mary Meg McCarthy's question. I'm wondering why we're focusing on the length of time that's reasonable instead of focusing on, shouldn't we be focusing more of our funding on judges or increasing the capacity of the courts? Because whether we like it or not, there are laws, and the laws exist for a reason, even though one could argue that they need to be fixed. So I'm just concerned that with all of this talk about time, they're taking too long. We're really chipping away at protections that these children have. And any asylum seeker has. I mean, good luck as a pro se litigant trying to say that you're a member of a particular social group, especially in light of all the recent changes in the law. So I'm wondering why we're focusing on the time these cases are taking because of this backlog, as opposed to maybe let's harp more on the funding. Sorry to ask a question.
So I'm going to make a friendly amendment to your question, if I may, which is, Secretary Chertoff, you worked very hard on the 2006 immigration bill and exceptionally hard on the 2007 immigration bill. You may not know that several cabinet officials spent days and weeks and months with members of Congress working on and negotiating the bill, something that is not all that common. And unfortunately, that bill and the bill of the year before failed. Both of those bills had completely uncontroversial provisions for improving, expanding the staffing and funding of the immigration courts. Do you have thoughts on why it's been so hard?
You know, I think it's been a process problem rather than a substantive problem. I think if you talk to people in both parties who have an interest in reforming the system, you would get about 98% agreement on what the major moving parts of a comprehensive bill would be. And I still spend time with the Bipartisan Policy Center. In Washington, we have a group trying to promote immigration reform. I think the principal challenges have been, first, how do you sequence it? In other words, there are elements of enforcement, and there are elements that also involve creating avenues for people to come to the U.S. legally, and then finally how to resolve the issue of people who came here illegally and are still here without permission. And what has tended to be the stumbling block is how do you make sure that all the pieces of a comprehensive reform get done, and that it's not just one part that gets done and the other part doesn't get done, and then some of the people feel the deal was not actually lived up to. One of the narratives about the 1986 Immigration Reform Act, which was the last really big immigration reform bill, is that the amnesty piece happened and the enforcement piece dropped away. So I think what people have been struggling with is how do you build a process that allows everybody on different sides of the issue to be comfortable that all the pieces of the compromise will actually be executed. And I think if you could do that, you could get this. And I still think we will get this, because I think the major muscle pieces are actually widely agreed. But we just have not been able, because of some process problems we see in Washington, to actually get this thing sequenced and passed in a way that would give everybody that sense of trust.
And so on the immigration courts more specifically, is it that it needs to be part of a package to get the attention it needs to
I think that probably on the immigration court, that's not a big issue of controversy. It's caught up in budget issues. There are a lot of things that cry out for help from the budget, and paying judges and lawyers tends not to excite the members of Congress as, wow, I can't wait to give more money to judges and lawyers. But I think if you could build it as part of a larger solution, you could absolutely get that done.
But I think it's also important to not kid ourselves. I mean, part of the reason why this is not solved is because, if you argue about these issues from a strictly good policy point of view, it should have been taken care of a long time ago. But let's face it, from a politics point of view, it's useful that it keeps broken. It is useful to keep it the way it is, because it keeps the issue so incredibly controversial, and in the process, make a lot of people suffer, including lawyers, as a matter of fact.
So we are coming up on our time, but I'm going to take one last question, and we're going to just try to keep our responses brief so we can stay with it right here up in the front. Thank you.
I'm Ken Lehman. Just this week, there has been press about the fact that migrant children who are in legal limbo are legally entitled to be enrolled in our schools. And to some extent, communities are fighting that and denying them the opportunity to be enrolled in schools. And I'm wondering, how widespread is this? And are there counseling and procedures to help these children, like you're advocating they need the legal help? Is there help to get them into the schools so, while they're in limbo and it takes a long time, that they're progressing?
Yeah, I mean, your question is a good one in terms of children having difficulty getting enrolled in school, and that certainly is happening in some communities. Other communities, it's not a problem. There is a Supreme Court ruling, Plyler v. Doe, that said that children, even if they don't have status, should be provided an education, must be provided an education, yes. And the reason for that is they're children. They're here, they're with us, and it's important for a child to have education, and we're not going to deny that to a person just because they're not documented. I know that the Department of Justice sent out a lot of information a while back to all of the school districts, telling districts you have to, this is your obligation to accept children whether they're undocumented or not. I think some of the school districts are throwing up hurdles right now. You need these documents, you need those documents, you need certain proof of who you're with and why you're here. These families need someone to challenge that because it's simply wrong. They need somebody to help them stand up to the school system because it's against the law.
I think in the larger scale of things, we are actually being fairly generous with the kids, But there are cases, as you well pointed out, where, and the New York Times had an article just about a week ago about a case in New York, in Suffolk, if I'm not mistaken, Suffolk County. But those are really more exceptional cases, and they need to be fought on two fronts. I mean, one, the law says that kids have to be in a school, period. And two, I think there is also a lot of misunderstanding about these kids being described somehow as freeloaders. People are forgetting that the relatives of these kids have been here for, in many times, more than 10 years, paying taxes across the board. So they are by no means, freeloaders in any way of the imagination. But again, remember, from the politics side, this becomes literally raw meat, to be able to once again bring up the idea that these people are coming to basically suck up our resources and just get a free ride.
We're coming up on our time, but anybody have any other final thoughts not to this question as we conclude?
Oh, I want to take advantage of inviting.
Maybe not you, Oscar.
No, inviting everybody to consider attending a conference on similar issues that we are hosting next Thursday, and you can get more information, including how to register, by visiting www.nalacc.org.
It's going to be a great conference. We'll have representation there.
And I would just like to say, not to end on a positive note, there are good things happening. The government is trying to find ways to provide children with attorneys, with pro bono attorneys. The government is improving the way the immigration courts are running for children. They've set aside special days or times of day for children to come to court, and that really helps a lot for a child to be able to walk into a courtroom that's filled with other children and not a room filled with adults. And I also think that the government agencies have been working together, I know they have, to try to develop a more child-appropriate system, to try to figure out a way to look at children's best interests within the framework of the immigration system. So I think there has been a lot of progress, and I think in part because of the spike in the number of children coming, people are paying a lot more attention, and the pieces that we've all been advocating for many years, some of them are starting to happen.
And I guess I'd leave with 2 points. One is, I think it is an important part of the solution here to move the discussion about asylum, if in fact people are entitled to asylum, back to the home country. That means creating opportunities if there are children who need asylum to have that addressed through a process where they originate. And at the same time, reduce what I consider to be illusion that somehow if they can survive a 1,000-mile crossing up to the US, they're going to be home free. And a lot of the problem with that, as I've said earlier, is that they may not survive that 1,000-mile trip. The second thing I would say is, this is just another feature of an immigration system that does need to be fixed. But that doesn't mean opening it up necessarily to open borders. What it means is having a process that gives us control of the borders, that gives us or creates a legal channel for people to come to the US and work, and that finds a resolution to those who are here illegally that is fair to both sides, those who came illegally, but also those who have a right to insist on the rule of law. And I think if you get that piece right, then you would actually eliminate a lot of the hydraulic pressure that draws people to come illegally and actually puts their own lives at risk.
On July 15, the MacArthur Foundation convened a meeting to try to begin to look at how best to respond to these issues. And I said something that I knew more instinctively than as a matter of fact at the time, and that is that for every one negative reaction against the kids, there are 10 welcoming reactions. Now I know as a matter of fact that it is true. And I was just in Texas, meeting with a whole bunch of religious leaders, and I was really blown away. To see how many people have been changed for the better as a result of this situation. The problem is those are news that don't sell. But let's face it, there is a lot of good heart in America, and we need to take advantage of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's thank our panel, Tara Magner, Secretary Chertoff, Maria Woltjen, Oscar Chacón. Thank you all for coming.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Our event is adjourned.